Before Synergies work, I was in and out of several mental health facilities. I had a lot of psychiatric problems that were undiagnosed for a long time, and I crocheted just to keep calm. I had nothing. I was donating all my stuff and not making a penny. Now I see the faces of my clients. I see their happiness, their sorrow, their disappointment, their angst, whatever they feel. Now, instead of just making stuff, keeping it, and then donating it to like the hospitals or the various places, I can now sell my items, which gives me money in my pocket and a goal in my brain. Synergies has helped me tremendously. It has given me a drive, a purpose. I feel fulfilled when I get up in the mornings, when I'm making something for a client.
Since he's become involved with Synergies Works, he's become a lot more happy, a lot more joyful. He thrives on taking orders from clients and crocheting something that they specifically want. He's more calm. He seems to feel like he's found his place, like he feels like he's found a spot where he's accepted finally in the world.
Synergy Works has allowed me to find and create a more clear picture of how I plan to build a future entrepreneur business based on service. It has helped me build a better idea of how to advertise said services. For me, on the spectrum, I don't do the best on condensing. I may provide too much information, or provide, or may perhaps go off on a bit of a tangent. So Synergies has helped me practice and improve how to deliver a 1-minute elevator speech. They've helped me learn what I need in searching for how to build my business, what I need maybe in a website. Also, they've also provided some tips for me on budgeting, managing expenses, what to do, how to keep the professional and personal expenses in life separate. It's constantly encouraged me to be able to ask for help and find new ways to look at solving a problem.
Synergies Work is an answer to all the questions one has about how to start a business. My son Aaron had an idea about his business, and we had no idea where to start. Synergies Work was a fantastic program, practical, accessible, taking us from A to Z. Instead of an amorphous idea about what his business will be, Synergies Work program helped him hone the idea, develop an elevator speech, think about who his audience is, so that we can move forward in terms of creating the business.
Morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session. As you can see, this film, my name is Aarti Sehgal, let me tell you, and I'm the founder of Synergies Work. As an organization, we are committed to empowering people with disabilities build their own sustainable businesses. We provide resources, we inspire people, provide opportunities, and work to close the network gaps that exist. We are just simply a catalyst between the business community and the disability world. As you saw in these videos of Brandon and Erin, employment is such an important part, an integral part of who we are as individuals. To quote Brandon, it puts pennies in his pocket and gives him a purpose, something to get up in the morning and do things. And hence, this conversation that we are happening today with our three important guests is very critical to me personally as a mother of a young man with Down syndrome and as the CEO of Synergies Work and the people that we serve. Before I introduce the guests and the facilitator who will be leading this conversation, let me just give you some broad housekeeping rules. This is an informal, intimate conversation between friends on this important topic. Please share your love, your comments, your questions, and we will pick them up throughout this conversation and talk that we will have. We have today with us Laurie and Erin, who are our ASL interpreters for the day. Thank you so much. And finally, we will be recording this session. So let me start by introducing Karen Hunter, who is the facilitator for this session today. Hi, Karen. Karen is an innovator, a strategist, and in her words, connector of dots. I just love that. She, after having worked with the Coca-Cola Company, Kimberly-Clark, PwC, and with another consulting firm, Deloitte, she now runs her own consulting firm. And more importantly, she's a dear friend and sits on the board of Synergies Work. I turn it over to you, Karen, to introduce our guests and take this conversation forward.
Great. So glad to be here, Arthi. Thank you so much for asking me to be part of this conversation. With over 1 billion people globally having disabilities, everyone knows someone who is impacted by a disability. And it could be something that's visible, it could be something that is not visible. So everyone should be thinking about what does the world look like for people with disabilities. We're at this great pivotal moment of social change and thinking more deeply about how do we engage with diverse communities of all sorts. And so today this conversation is about bringing together a group of people who have both a personal passion as well as professional interest in how the disabled become engaged with businesses and how they can move forward professionally. So I'd love to introduce our panel today. I'm really excited to have them here. First up, we have Carrie Stimmel. Carrie is the Executive Vice President of Advertising, Sales, and Partnership at NBC Universal. She sits in New York. She leads sales teams who manage national advertising programs and partnerships. And she's got this great role in organizing the sales and marketing operations team and is very involved in the Hispanic movement. She's also been very active in BravoCon and People's Choice and many more. So excited to have you here, Carrie. Thanks for coming.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And next up, we've got Tom Kuo. Tom is an investor. He's an advisor. He's been working with private and public companies for 20 years. He used to lead business services and technologies for Berkshire Partners, but has been out on his own since the end of 2019. Is that correct?
Actually, at the end of 2020.
2020, thanks. He's on a number of boards, the boards of Acela, that provides software for state and local governments, Mighty Earth, the climate advocacy group. He's the board chair for Teach for America and co-chair for the board of advisors for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So incredibly diverse set of interests and a great advocate for public services. And then last but not least, we have Lindsay Wilkinson, who I've really gotten the pleasure to get to know over the last year. Lindsay is the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility and Public Affairs at Cox here in Atlanta, where I am. She oversees the company's approach to ESG and corporate social responsibility reporting, impact measures, and civic engagement activities. So welcome, everybody. Good to see you. This, I hope, is going to be more of a conversation than just a Q&A. So I would like to do a little bit of a round robin to start out with, and maybe, Lindsay, I'll start with you. What's your personal connection with diversity and inclusion for people with disabilities?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think this conversation is super important. So as part of my work, I do a lot of work with our inclusion, diversity, and equity team, and have for most of my career. So I'm familiar from a business side, but my true sort of personal connection is I have 3 children, one of whom, Miles, he's 7 years old, has cerebral palsy and short bowel syndrome. And so have really been, as a result of that, thrust into this world of thinking about, what employment might look like for him in the future, seeing how, society can be hard for him to integrate with, and just very, very passionate about raising these issues, both personally and in the workplace.
Great. Tom, what about you? What's your personal connection?
Yeah, well, first of all, Karen, thank you for doing this, and Arthi for asking me to be a part of this. It is very important work. My connection comes from so many places. I guess really, first and foremost, friends and neighbors who are loving parents, just like Arthi, Lindsay, Carrie, also who are dedicated to, I think, creating really just opportunities for their kids with disability. And also in my day-to-day work, I've had really the joy of partnering with an incredible entrepreneur and now very close friend who employs and actually also explicitly serves through her business people with disabilities, and have seen the power of that mission to inspire really great things and actually build an incredible company as well. So that's my connection.
It's great. And Carrie, over to you. What's your connection?
It's so funny because I'm going to throw you for a loop here. I actually have a few connections, but my number one connection is my son, who is on the autistic spectrum. My 9-year-old light of my life. I just had his IEP, individual education program, meeting yesterday, so I'm like ready to go today. I'm fired up. But I was talking to my husband about doing this panel, and I said, all I've really shared is about Jason, our son, but my father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis right after I was born. I have a nephew who attempted to commit suicide at the age of 14 and has never been able to speak or communicate and needs help walking and getting around. Michigan is doing some incredible things with Michigan Adaptive Sports for him, which has just been out of this world to see. There is a boy who I've been close with since he was 8 years old, who's also on the autistic spectrum. And I like to think of it as my higher power's way of getting me ready for my son. And he and I speak every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. He's now 23. We got connected when he was 8, but we speak every Sunday morning. He's in assisted living. So I actually have, I said, I don't know why I haven't shared this with the group. I'm like, I've only talked about Jason, but I actually have some very, very close personal connections that make this extremely important to me. And I feel very fortunate to have been connected to Artie.
That's terrific. And it really does highlight all of the different dimensions of our lives where disabilities can touch us and intersect. So we really started this conversation when Arthi and I started talking about this, talking about diversity and diversity and inclusion, which is obviously a huge topic for the last year, most importantly. So I'd love for you guys to just talk about your definitions of diversity and how does it intersect with people with disabilities?
I'm happy to start if no one else wants to jump in. Yeah, actually, when you sent this question over, I hadn't really thought about how I, put into words my definition of diversity. I'm so used to, through my work, sort of living and breathing how things are defined and measured in the business space. But I think for me, diversity really has to do with the diversity of life experience, and how that shows up in your everyday world, whether it's, having faced discrimination and what that means for your community, or whether it's, a medical life experience that has left you lack of mobility, but I think, and also sort of diversity of thought and perspective and the sort of psychological aspects there. So it's really about, to me, what experience have shaped you in a person and what that means for how you interact with the world.
Carrie Town, what do you think?
For me, it was funny because when I read the question too, it seemed like such an easy, well, of course I know what diversity is. And then it really made me pause and stop and think. I mean, I've always considered diversity to go, of course, race and ethnicity, but to go much deeper than that. Obviously, a person's physical abilities or disabilities are front and center for me. Personally, but I think it's gender, I think it's culture background, I think it's socioeconomic background, age, and it's sexual orientation, geographic location. I mean, it's so encompassing, and for me personally, I feel like there's such value whenever you can bring people together, and I've certainly I belong to an organization separately where it's a bit of a self-help group, and I have found so much help in hearing from people who have very different backgrounds, everything I just named, in terms of finding the answers. I rarely find the answers from somebody who looks and sounds just like me. I'm not too interested in that, so that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I was just going to, first of all, I'm glad you both went first, because I also struggled to really cleanly define what diversity meant for me, but I kind of went to, I guess, the easiest place is what does it feel like? And Carrie, something you just said there really resonated with me. And Lindsay, your description of life experiences as a part of the definition also resonated in that, for me, it's sort of being in a diverse group means feeling like you're a little unsure of what is the sort of path, and as a result, you're open-minded and you're learning from other people, and you're able to step in, or at least trying to step into some of their perspectives and trying to get into what the life experiences have been. And to me, that is very, very broad. That can be a number of different things, as we talked about. It can be identity, it can be life experience as defined and created by disability, race, certainly, absolutely, gender, all those things. But diversity for me is that feeling of there's not a dominance, and there's not a clear only one way of doing things, but there's this openness to learning, and there's an openness to other perspectives that's just palpable. And so I can honestly tell you, I've been very, I haven't found that in many places in my life, but one of the things that I'm really excited about at this point in time in our history and culturally today, I feel like we're getting closer and closer to that being a possibility.
Lindsay, you hit on something that I think is really interesting. It's the dichotomy between your personal definition and potentially a corporate definition, what we live in corporations. So talk to me about how you're seeing your companies talk about diversity. What are the things that are going on within your companies?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in again first. I mean, I think I've been at Cox now for about a year and a half, and what I see there is this really incredible focus on the employees. I mean, as a private company, there's that stakeholder group is really, truly, from a cultural perspective, front and center, which is great because it means there's lots of like the bones of and focus on creating this inclusive workplace culture and this recognition that inclusion means something different to everybody, as opposed to and creating a culture of safety. We talk a lot about people being able to feel safe at work, from being able to bring them their whole selves and not feel like they have to hide anything. And then however, sort of in general, from the inclusion, diversity, and equity space, I think there's, businesses are so focused on the things that are measurable and that you can put numbers against, which I love because I'm a total numbers nerd, but I think is really hard when you get into this diversity and inclusion space, because like, where's your success metrics, it's really hard to find and see it because yes, you can look at, inclusion perception on employee surveys, or you can look at, what percentage of your executives are persons of color. But what that does is it forces diversity into these categories and things of way that it's manifested, like, oh, we have this many persons of color, this many women, this many people with disabilities, and really focuses on that like outward manifestation of what is diverse and different, as opposed to necessarily the sort of more intrinsic like diversity of thought and experience that just comes to light as a result of those things.
I'll jump in too. I would echo what you started with, which is measuring. I think measuring is probably the most critical thing. It's, and I'm in sales, so we have all of these areas that we measure to get paid. And I think that, having an NBC Universal has does very much measure on the diversity, equity, and inclusion front, and who we're interviewing, who we're hiring, but also, I guess the way I would sum that up is also being very intentional about it. And I think that that's a word that you're finally starting to hear. The companies have to be intentional, and we are being very intentional. We invest a lot of money. We have the Employee Resources Group, ERG, which we give an acronym to everything. It's not really a business unit unless it has an acronym. And I would say that within that, there's 9 chapters that are part of what's called My Abilities, which are focused on people with disabilities. For our employees and people like me to educate ourselves. I would also say that we are doubling down on mentorship programs. And for me personally, what I've noticed, and this is across all diverse groups, it has to go so much further than acceptance. I almost cringe when I hear the word acceptance. Like that's a gift, accepting. And that's the mother in me, by the way. That's the mother of an autistic son in me that gets, her back up against a wall when I hear acceptance. Well, of course, thank you for accepting my son. But I think, it's really about inclusion and what happens after you make that intentional hire. And I'm really proud to say, we're focused on mentorship programs for underrepresented groups and providing a community. Because for any diverse group, if a community is not provided, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for that person. It's not going to work for the company. And wow, as a leader at NBC Universal, I don't want to miss out on that opportunity. There's so many opportunities with underrepresented groups, and specifically as we're talking about today, people with disabilities, that, what a shame if that community is not created and we aren't tapping into every bit of full potential that is there.
What about you, Tom? What is, particularly in the investment community, what are the conversations that are going on with investors? Is this coming up at all?
It certainly is coming up. And I'd say, the investing world, in particular the world I came from of private equity, just as taking a big step back, it's an industry which may not be so apparent in terms of its influence and importance, but the amount of companies and people employed by private equity owned businesses is growing every day. And it's an incredibly powerful group of investors who are, I'd say, usually on the tail end of really truly embracing things like a true commitment to diversity. That being said, this is a different time, and at no time in the last 20 years have I ever seen that group move as fast to not just say they're doing the right thing, but really try to understand what to do now. So what does that look like, and where are they struggling? I think one of the things that's easy for them to do is sign letters, do marketing pieces. What's very hard for them to do is, and these are my words, not anybody else's, is get messy and figure out where not just their shortcomings are, but also their blind spots. And so one of the things that's happening in the world of investing today is not just hiring a head of corporate diversity and saying we have somebody who's in charge of that now, but actually bringing the entire employee base, the companies that we invest in and own, the employee bases of those companies into the discussion and saying, help us figure out what we're missing here. I'd say most investors who are good investors are really about the data. They're really about not being biased and not saying that we know everything, but actually trying to be truth seeking. And so in that context, these kinds of getting messy and exploration conversations to me are just beginning, but when where they are happening, that feels very markedly different than it has been in the past in terms of just the window dressing around this. So you're seeing a lot of that. The second thing is you're seeing the advent of things like the B Corporation, which I don't know if you guys know what this is, but this idea that there's a sort of a certification for a company that has a social benefit, not just a business benefit. Within those frameworks, and in particular the B Corporation certification, there are explicit questions about whether companies are hiring from traditionally underrepresented or underemployed populations, including populations with disabilities. So there's an intentionality, to use the term, Carrie, I think that you used, around this now. And there's measurement, Lindsay, as you were saying, around this now. It's the early days, but at least it's a start.
You know, you've hit on two really interesting things that I think are intertwined. It's the blind spots. You know, if we're talking about diversity inclusion, what are the blind spots? Where does the disability conversation come in the D&I conversation? And then kind of to the earlier discussion, does this certificate for social benefits, does that pigeonhole people into, you know, we're trying to make numbers as opposed to we're trying to have a bigger impact? So I'd just like to tee up when you're hearing D&I conversations, where does the disability community come up in those conversations?
I from my perspective, I think it's, and I think probably everyone on this call would agree, is sort of can be a bit overlooked, especially, and maybe this is bold to say, but you know, over the past year with this so much focus on sort of social justice, you know, there's been just sort of a swirl of activity, you know, around those particular groups of people and inclusion and representation. And what I hope is, and what I've seen is that that change in sort of thinking will help all of the, you know, communities that are underrepresented, and really help people realize how, you know, how intertwined those communities are. The word that you hear all the time now is equity. You know, like departments, they're not just diversity inclusion, but it's diversity, inclusion, and equity, which I think is a great conversation that's starting to happen at big companies, that may have been happening for years, but has been elevated. And particularly for the disability community, I think that equity one is very important. Equity being recognizing that, you know, not everyone needs exactly the same things to be successful. So, you know, from a disability community, like that would be like everybody's got access to the stairway, but what about the person that can't walk? You know, and I think that now that those conversations are at the very most senior levels, you're seeing it's hopeful that thinking will trickle down and through orgs.
I'd love to play off of something you said that I think is important, which is, you know, talking about the social justice movement, which I am just happy we've gotten here on that.
Yeah.
You know, I would say this is probably the biggest social justice movement since the civil rights era. What I would add is that it's not mutually exclusive. And I think what you hit upon is the intersectionality. Like, you can be Black and disabled at the same time. I have this conversation on the Hispanic front quite often. It's like, it's not always two independent groups when we're talking about Black Americans and Hispanic. I'm like, you do know Hispanic people can be Black, right? And it's like, but there's this desire to put things in completely separate buckets. And I think that there's this enormous intersectionality going on The other thing that Tom said that hit me was, I don't even know exactly the sentence you used, but you talked about it being messy. And I feel such relief that across the board, both personally and professionally, that it is becoming okay and normalized to have messy conversations. And I personally do believe that it is messy, gets messier on the disability front. And it is almost like, oh, don't look. Oh, like, no, like, don't look away, right? Like it is messy. And I think people are afraid to ask. I think people are afraid, across all underrepresented groups for sure. But I think it gets more pronounced for people with disabilities to ask the questions. I mean, we've really been trying to encourage, like, I have people on my team, this is more on the racially diverse, who have raised their hands and said, I want to be a safe space for you to ask dumb questions. And that has been hugely helpful. And so this has all gotten me thinking, and I am pretty open with my team, which is how I ended up here today. Somebody who works on one of my teams who got connected to Artie through something else. But because of my openness about my son and my challenges, that connection was made. And I think, I share, without going completely crazy, I share a very, very large part of my personal story and my personal life at the office, because I'm a huge believer that if things aren't going well at home, they're not going to go well at the office. And if things aren't going well at the office, they're not going to go well at home. And so I don't make them mutually exclusive or different. And I've almost always benefited by allowing myself to be vulnerable, and asking the stupid questions.
I like that you call them the stupid questions. I think it's one thing I actually think about a lot with my son is how I wish so many more people could be like how other children interact with him. The little girl at the playground will come up and be like, why is he in a wheelchair? Why isn't he talking? And it's just so open and honest about but genuinely just curious. And I'm like, how can we cultivate that more as adults?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that. So much. No, please, Carrie, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's so much more empowering than the quick look away.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the interesting opportunity we have now as a society is living through this, the shared trauma of a pandemic, on top of this upwelling of interest and focus on the need for social equity and justice. And all of this gives us an opportunity to rethink the way that we actually interact with one another. And so while we're all remote on cameras and things like that, the ability for us as human beings to get to know each other, I feel like some of the barriers have been cleared away. Some of the social stigma from just getting into that messy discussion has been cleared away. It'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years, whether the sort of acuteness of what we just all are living through right now fades a little bit, and whether those old habits die hard or if they continue to lead us to a better place.
It's interesting. Go ahead.
I was going off on another tangent. I don't mean to interrupt.
I was just curious about, because neurodiversity is such a broad space, and there are people who are in the business world today who are neurodiverse, but may feel like they have to hide it or they have to have compensating behaviors. Any thoughts about how to make neurodiversity a part of the conversation? How can corporations make people with neurodiversity feel more confident and comfortable in what they're doing?
I would say be intentional, going back to the intentional. The other thing that I'll talk a little bit about, I think, in terms of working for, a communications media company, there is a social responsibility there, and NBCU is part of what's called the Rudderman Family Foundation. And it is a commitment to seeing people with disabilities for all roles for television and film. Then, additionally, we have an accessibility director. Her name is Lori Samuels. And so once you bring in somebody with a disability, making sure you're properly representing on what we put out there. And I think that, of course, my company is a unique situation, so this isn't going to apply to all companies, but, it's people have to be able to see themselves on television, in film, and it also can be a great educator for people who don't have disabilities, right? And so I think that, again, it's about making an intentional move to say, okay, we're going to see people with disabilities for all roles. We're going to get them on camera. We're going to represent properly, and go from there. And this is not my network, but one of my favorite shows. Don't tell on me that I'm saying a non-NBC show, but it was Atypical. As the mother of an autistic son, it was a big wow for me. And I started, found myself hoping and dreaming about where his possibilities lie.
I think you hit on something that I think is important, and definitely something that companies can do is that that has been successful is that focus on the top, or make sure you've got your ducks in a row there, because people need to be able to see themselves in their leadership. And when you see a leader being vulnerable or talking about some whether they're neurodiverse or otherwise, if you see your leadership coming out and feeling safe and comfortable sharing those personal struggles or things like that, then it just creates this culture of like, oh, it's okay to talk about it. If you see that happening. So I think that's something certainly is encouraging, leadership of creating that vulnerability and showing up. And one thing I think Cox does really well is sort of employee listening, and spending a lot of time focused on listening to employees, providing opportunities for feedback. It's all sorts of different ways of doing that, because some people are comfortable speaking up in a town hall. Some people want to do an anonymous survey. Some people, and recognizing that people have different preferences there to really show themselves or to speak what they're hearing, and then being able to go back and say, okay, great, we heard you. This is what we're doing about it. And I think that point around people not feeling comfortable coming forward with things they're struggling with is a really tough one to crack. But all those activities that create that culture of safety, or ERGs, ways to engage, and things like that, just really help.
Well, I was also going to say, and I don't usually just go to the kind of business opportunity is there, but I'd say that the awareness that we don't have a monoculture or a mono market, if you will, has spawned so many really interesting entrepreneurial efforts around serving a more diverse population, including neurodiversity, and also giving companies the resources. And if you just wanted to use shorthand of consultants, for example, to actually help think through the right way to engage a neurodiverse or a different population that isn't just all the same. And those are technology tools. Those are networks of people who are trained to help people who are maybe not comfortable with the language get comfortable, or at least get messy with the language. There's a lot of, I'd say, creation going around right now that, again, to be determined how much of this ultimately is successful and sustained and grows to something different and bigger in the future. But that creation is happening now as companies try to figure out, what the next phase of their employee engagement should look like. Not just because of return to work in person, but also in sort of the current environment that we have and conversations that we're having around diversity and inclusion.
So we talked a good bit about how companies might think about incorporating more disabled-friendly approaches. I'd be curious to get your perspective on, if I'm a manager, if I'm a people manager, how do I, as an individual, make sure that I am creating those safe spaces, that I'm being as inclusive as I can be? Carrie, what would you want Jason's future boss to be and do for him?
I would want his future boss to be just like me. No, I'm I'm totally kidding.
You are his future boss in many ways.
No, you know what? It's funny. So, I mean, and by the way, the only reason I'm a halfway decent boss, I'm only going to give myself a halfway decent mark, is because of my son. I didn't learn, I truly don't think I knew that much about being a leader until he came along. And it's about celebrating the differences and leaning into them. And listen, it's very funny that again, the universe served up a son who's a complete perfectionist. Like, it's very black and white. He lives in a black and white world. If things aren't perfect, it's ruined, it's garbage. And when I got my first at NBCU, we do what's called 360 reviews, and you get to hear all the things, all the feedback from people who work for you, people who are your peers, and people that are above you. And you know, they tell you all the nice things first, and then they give you the developmental areas, which is, you know, the things you're not so good at. And my developmental areas, it was one of the, she's a perfectionist. She wants everything to be perfect. She wants us to be perfect. If it's not perfect, she's not happy. And I'm like, you know, and then all of a sudden, by the time which really broke my heart, because my perfectionism was wearing off on my team, and they felt like they had to be perfect. It was really eye-opening. And then I was given this gift of a son who I constantly, on a daily basis, have to say, it doesn't have to be perfect. Come on, you don't have to be perfect, buddy. And I'm like, wow. And so I've, you know, that I brought into the workplace in terms of I've actually learned that the people who are on my team, there are some things they're never going to be great at. I do not try and make them great at those things anymore. And I learned that from my son. My son is amazing at math. He's been counting to 1,000 since he was 3. Like, it is off the charts. Reading and social studies, boy, do we have a hard time there. And I don't try and make him great at everything. I let him enjoy science and math and lean into that strength, and same, you know, with my team. And that's whether somebody has a disability or not. Quite frankly, it's applicable to, are you celebrating what's different? Are you not trying to make them just like yourself? Are you leaning into the strengths and letting some of the other stuff go? I brought a prop, and I'm going to show it to you. This because I came upon this. This was something my son made when he was 5. He was asked to say what he wanted to be when he grew up, and of all the things he could choose, he chose, "I want to be a regular person." Now I get choked up and cry. I would never, ever in a million years, my dream for my son is not to be a regular person. And so for me, like, it's been that has been like a guiding force for me in terms of, I do not want him to be regular. There's enough regular people out there. There's enough boring, regular people, and he's not one of them. And how cool is that? So I try and bring that into the workplace as well.
I think that's a great lesson for anyone. We all approach the world in different ways. We can't all, just because it's your way, does it mean it's the right way? Everybody brings different skills into the party. Lindsay, what about you? What do you see as a great boss for your son, for Miles?
I think, I mean, back to what was already said around strengths-based leadership, I've always been a big, of course you want to work on things that, you struggle with, but leaning into those strengths, I think, is so, so, so important. I think, creating that, like, working on empathy and showing your own vulnerability with your employees, I think is just so meaningful, because they'll open up if you can do that and you let them know it's okay that just like, I was really struggling with this at work. I'm not perfect. And that's okay. And I think for my son, it's maybe a patience thing for me, and like finding what's going to work for him, because I don't know. He's young. I don't know where he's going to land from an ability perspective. His cognition is really, really good. but he doesn't speak. He communicates with the tablet, and that's been one of our sort of like big COVID aha moments. Is like once we've gotten over that hump of figuring out how to communicate, it's like, oh my gosh, you were soaking up absolutely everything, and so much more. And I think that just goes back to that patience and that time to figure it out, because everybody's so different in what their needs are, especially in this particular community of folks.
Tom, what do you think the investor world should be doing? What are the approaches they could be thinking about to be more inclusive with people with disabilities?
Well, I think first of all, going back to one of the earlier questions, I would hope that the investment community would be more proactive, intentional around efforts to increase hiring and selling to whatever it is, but basically putting disabilities in the disability community more centered to what they're doing. So first and foremost, I think there needs to be much more of an intentionality around it. That doesn't exist everywhere today. That being said, I think, and this is a little bit of a tactical of the moment thing, but they should sort of ride the coattails of all of the other efforts that are going on right now around broadly defined ESG social responsibility, because the way that change is happening in the investment community right now is not just because people are saying it's the right thing to do, but dollars are flowing. When the investors themselves, so these are in the case of my old world, large endowments and pension funds are telling their managers, the funds that are managing money for them, you have to be intentional and measure diversity of all sorts. They are starting to move because they know they have to. And so I actually go back to that original kind of where the dollars flow is where things will change. And in the investor community, I actually think it should start with the ultimate source of those dollars, which are their big pension funds, who, by the way, have been for many years at the forefront of a lot of social change. So why and today they still should be in terms of their dollars. So I think that's one place they can start, which is really where the dollars originate, and putting pressure on their funds that they're investing into to make real change.
Great. So okay, Carrie.
I was just going to add, it's funny because with this conversation I've been having a lot for the past year, I think everybody knows and understands that it's the right thing to do, right? But what I've been trying to spend more time on is it also makes companies money. And Tom was alluding to that a little bit, but in a different way. But if you put a diverse group of people into a conference room, you are going to get such better ideas coming out. Every single time, the company will make money. If you diversify your team, you will unquestionably make more money. So my conversation has been, not internally, but externally, okay, if you don't want to do it because it's the right thing to do it because you want to make money. Because you will.
Yeah, Carrie, I was just going to say, it's interesting you say that, because there's actually very good research in the venture capital community around exactly this point, which is, actually, it's a professor at HBS that I'm working with on some news research, but he looked at teams that were more diverse in the venture capital world and showed through data that those outperform other non-diverse teams. And so it's not just the sound bites; it's real data and real proven outcomes.
There's also research that points to innovation. The more diverse your teams are, the more innovative you are as a company. And also, I mean, it's full circle, like retention of employees is building an inclusive workplace. Someone will stay if they feel safe.
It also costs a lot of money. Every time you lose an employee, it costs the company.
And it goes back to money. Yeah. I mean, there's the business cases, rock solid. So
I will say encouraging, like I tend to follow, there's 30 companies, there's more actually, but I'm always like, who are the top companies hiring people with autism? Microsoft is always at the top. Microsoft is at the top, and it has to do with engineering jobs, has to do with data analysis, data scientists. But there's Walgreens, who's like Walmart. Walgreens and Walmart are both on the list, but Walmart is very much customer service focused. And if you want to be customer service focused, you better have people inside your walls that represent your community, your full community. So they've very much doubled down on that, again, back to making money. But there are a significant number of companies who are intentionally seeking out neurodiverse employees, again, because they think differently. They bring a different way of seeing it. I mean, when I go back to the office, I won't get dressed without my son choosing my shoes.
I think that comes full circle to what you said earlier, Carrie, which was you get the best ideas from people who don't look like you. And so I'm gonna start to wrap up a little bit, because I thought that was a really great way to start this conversation. And I'm hearing about the intentionality, and really be intentional about your purpose and how you're thinking about bringing people with disabilities into your organization, and also to embrace the skills that people have, that not everyone's going to have the same skills, but to leverage those skills that people actually bring. And think beyond just the hard numbers of, we have this many people of color and this many people of this sexual orientation, but to think about more broadly, we have these types of thinkers, and these types of communities that we're building as a business, and that should ladder back to better business performance at the end of the day. Just going to go around one more time. If there's anything you wanted to leave this audience with as a final thought, what would you want them to know? Carrie, I'll start with you. Put you on the spot, sorry.
I'm going to lead with what has become my mantra, and it came years ago, shortly after my son was diagnosed when he was 3. So this is at least 5 or 6 years ago. I was reading everything I could. And first of all, I think you can get a lot of help and information from people who share a similar problem as you. That has been my experience with almost every problem or challenge I've had to personally overcome, is I don't seek out experts. I seek out people who share the problem. This woman wrote an article, the 8 things I wish I had done differently as the mother of an autistic son. I don't remember 7 of them. The one I remember is, and it may have literally made my mantra, is I wish I would have spent more time going into his world instead of forcing him into my world. And I say that out loud almost on a daily basis, and I've really been a mother in that way. And the gifts I have received, as well as the amount he has grown, and that can apply to business, that can apply to almost anything. If you stop trying to shove people into your own world and take a moment to step into theirs, it goes a really, really long way.
Great. Tom, what about you?
Well, I was gonna go back to the reason I'm here, which is, Arti reached out to me, not as a parent that has, of a child with disability, but as somebody who thought would listen to her passion and her story. And so what I would leave people with is this: we're all connected as a community. We all have different sort of areas of focus or different passions, but we're all connected, and bringing allies to these kinds of discussions is really important, because that's where we're going to build enough social mass, if you will, and change and effort to actually change things together. So for me, I come in from a slightly different place than here, but it's so fulfilling that I've been a part of this. So thank you all.
And Lindsay, what about you?
Gosh, final thoughts. I think I'll take this one back to personal and then tell you how I think it connects. I think one of the things that really frustrated me early on as a caregiver and parent of a son with cerebral palsy is I just heard all the time, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that this happens to you, that this happened to your son." And it, to be frank, just always kind of pissed me off, because I'm like, this is not a bad thing. It's a different thing. And you can't see that. And I don't understand why. And so what I would say my largest takeaway from that has been, both for the workplace and in personal life, is, just always look for the value that someone is bringing, whether you can see it immediately or not. Because I would not change a single thing about my son and the world that we're in, and it has brought so many things to the table that I never ever would have experienced with a typical child. And so I think that's so important, and you can do that with not just, with everyone on perspectives and things like that, is that thinking from someone else's shoes.
I love that. That's a real, it's a great ending about empathy, about being inclusive, and about thinking about people with disabilities in a different way, and a more inclusive way. Carrie, Tom, Lindsay, thank you so much for the time and all of your thoughts and your passion around this topic. We really appreciate it, Synergies work. I'm going to turn it over to Arthi to close things out for us. But thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much, Karen, for this conversation. And thank you, Lindsay, Tom, and Carrie, for having this conversation. And oh my God, I can't tell you how many notes I must have taken while you were talking, right down from what you spoke about, what happens after an inclusion, what intentionality matters. You have got to do the messy job of having these conversations in safe environment, from a place where what you mentioned, Tom, that we are all connected, that we all are one, irrespective from where we are coming from. It just brings a story to my mind, something that I read today morning only. It's about this a gentleman who visits a Greek monastery, and that Greek monastery is perched on top of a high cliff. So the only way to get to that monastery is through a rope basket. And as he's sitting on to that rope basket to climb up, he turns around and asks the monk, how often do you change the rope? And the answer is, as often as it breaks. Clearly, this is a case of being reactive rather than being proactive. And many a times when we are talking about these issues in the disability world, in our community, or talking about social justice, we are talking as a reaction. But at Synergies work, we are taking it from the front end. We are leading the solution. And I am so happy that I found my tribe in this conversation today, because you are the leaders, Tom, Carrie, Lindsay, Karen, who are leading this conversation from the forefront. You're making a difference. And I invite and I thank all of the Synergies work team and the audience who are present here today, who are part of this change that is taking place. And I can't thank you enough for it. So please join us, join Synergies work. We, in leading this conversation, become an investor in that change. And you can do this in many ways. You can invest by giving us $1 a day. All our services, whether it is the open studios of building up the art entrepreneurs, or it is I2I business learning program that we host and provide services to entrepreneurs for not just 8 weeks or a short time, but 2 to 3 years. We provide every service at no cost to our participants. And we rely on the impact funds that we garner from the community, from the corporations, and from you to support other entrepreneurs. So once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of such an important conversation. And I hope to see you again very much here again soon. Thanks again, Sign One News, for making this happen, Laurie, Erin, and the entire Synergies work team.